Welcome back to Wellbeing Wednesdays, brought to you by the Tulane University Counseling Center. I am Shawna Foose, one of the therapists at the Counseling Center. I'm one of your co-hosts for today, and I'm joined as always by my lovely co-host.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jinaki, Flint, staff psychologist here at the Counseling Center, and we are joined by Terrebonne, Dr. Taylor Terrebonne, who is also staff psychologist here at the Counseling Center. Welcome, Taylor. Looking forward to hearing your presentation today.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me too.
So Taylor, you're coming to us today to talk a little bit about connection in the time of COVID, which I think is a topic we're all struggling with, how to connect to others and maintain those relationships. So why don't you just kind of launch for us and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the reasons that this topic stood out to me so much is I think at baseline, forming relationships at college can be very stressful and very pressure filled. But in this pandemic, I think it's really changed the nature of how we relate to people so much that it can be really overwhelming, I think, and requires, I think, a lot more intentionality and creativity on our end in how we're relating. So I think it's just something that could be really useful to kind of talk about, like, what does this look like practically for us? And what are some of the things that maybe can help facilitate better ability to connect with one another? So I have a brief presentation to kind of go along with some of this. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys.
Okay.
Let's see. All right, can you guys see this okay?
Yeah.
All right, so kind of as it relates to what relating looks like, I think that we're all kind of experiencing some general concerns that come up when we think about what connecting in this time looks like. There's some things that kind of remain constant even without the pandemic, but things that are definitely a lot more extreme or problematic when we think about the lens of the kind of social sphere that we're living in right now. So things like, how do I meet people? How do I get to know other people in this time? How do I hang out with people or spend time with the people that I've met once I meet them? And doing so, especially knowing that since a lot of things are virtual right now, how do I limit the amount of time I'm spending on something like Zoom or on my screen time to prevent burnout from that? Because there is this really strong mental and emotional connection and fatigue that then comes from spending time on the screen. It really impacts us in that way. And then also thinking about, as I'm forming relationships, how do I really get them to be deeper? Knowing that there's limitation, there's not the same amount of quality time or ability to invest quality time that we would typically see if we were kind of organically spending time with people. And how do we really focus and intensify our relationships in a meaningful way that feels more in line with true connection? And then also that sense or that worry of falling behind, you know, especially for students who are coming in who maybe are in their first or second year. I think there can be a lot of pressure to make relationships or find their friend group or identify who they can spend time with here in the community. And I think when we look at relationships that other people may have, there could be this sense of like, am I behind? Like, am I somehow lacking in a way that I'm not going to be able to catch up to some of these other friendships that have formed? And kind of along with that, I'm going to click through. I think that it's meaningful for us to remember that this is also a common experience. I think something about the nature of COVID causes us to feel really isolated in many ways, and because there is this literal physical isolation that at times we're experiencing, especially as quarantine guidelines change, as restrictions change over time. I think one thing that can be a helpful frame for us is remembering that we aren't alone in the experience of feeling worried about forming relationships. And we're also not the only ones who are wanting that sense of connectivity. I think there's this common desire among all of us to form meaningful relationships that are lasting, that have a positive impact for our life, and that allow for that sense of connectivity that we're really hoping to gain. And I think it's also meaningful to note, in much the same way as there may be this pressure to have this strong college experience, all of us are kind of in that pressure right now. College looks different for every person who is in college right now than it's looked for anyone who was ever in college before. So the way that we think of like the collegiate experience, I think is really different in this time. So to know, how do I seek to have the college experience that maybe has been communicated to me or something that I've dreamed of or hoped of given these changes and these restrictions? And can I have some flexibility in how I think about the college experience, knowing that some of it inherently is going to look really different? Like, how do I accept that change? And then also thinking about how to be creative in how we connect with other people, because there are just inherently changes and restrictions that now come. You know, and I wanted to ask you guys, you know, thinking about some of this common experience, like, has this been something that you guys have felt or seen, especially like as you've been talking with students this semester?
Yeah, definitely. I was going to mention that I've spoken with, for example, freshman students and said, you know, it's not like you can look to your upperclassmen peers and say, well, how did you do it when your first year of college was during a pandemic, right? There's no one to look to for how this is done. We're all having to invent it and reinvent it and adjust without anyone really to guide us. And I think that can feel really isolating.
Yeah.
Not to mention that there's the absence of a lot of ritual that would normally be occurring during this time. The kind of the senior rituals of high school, right? Graduations, proms, things like that, that kind of ushered students into college for the first time. The normal orientations and the events that would happen to welcome students into college look different or are non-existent, right? So the adjustment to college is different, right? So especially for, you know, incoming students that are coming in for the first time, I think the absence of those rituals have been really impactful.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a tangible loss in a major way. And I
Yes.
think that there's not always that conversation about the grief of that loss. This is truly a shift. And I think too, with ritual, there's such a sense of community that often comes from ritual, and that
Yes.
community connectivity has been lost in a major way and changed. And I think that there can be a lot of internal pressure, like personal pressure in forming relationships, that can kind of weigh of like, what am I doing wrong? How do I do something different? But I think that we can't have a conversation about relationship without acknowledging the grief of that loss, as well as like the general loss of community that's come. This isn't necessarily about personal responsibility to form relationship. There is kind of this collective grief that we are experiencing. And that is emotionally impactful too. And I think can then later impact our motivation to even want to form relationships, to put in this extra effort, because things that would otherwise kind of come naturally aren't occurring in the same way. Yeah. I think in thinking about that, knowing while we may not have that sense of community in the same way, we do have this shared experience of being in this unprecedented time. And so we don't have those individuals we can look to know how to navigate this, but we are all together in this experience. And I think being aware of that can maybe offer a sense of community in a different way, of knowing we're not alone in this struggle. We are all in this experience of pandemic and of desire to form relationship together, which is a different community. It's maybe one that we wouldn't intuitively want for ourselves, but I think it's meaningful to consider.
I agree.
Yeah.
You know, kind of in thinking about that, I think that leads me to think about if we aren't having these kind of pillars for engagement that we would typically have, or these rituals that would typically lead to connectivity, how do we seek to connect in a meaningful way? And I think one thing that stands out to me is kind of being creative. Like, how do we thoughtfully connect to one another? Are we able to utilize like different ways of relating, whether that's different forms of communication, or maybe saying yes to opportunities that we typically would not say yes to? I think this is a big one, because with this whole pandemic, there is such a large sense of discomfort. I think it's difficult for us to challenge ourselves to engage in things that add further discomfort to us. I think that's really a challenge when weighing like, what kind of activity do I want to engage in? Because there may be certain activities or social gatherings online, for example, that we may not typically consider. But in this time, is it meaningful for us to maybe challenge ourselves to receive the greater reward or the greater meaning of connecting, if that's something we really value? And also thinking about like, how can we utilize space as best as we can? There are certainly limitations and restrictions we have on what gatherings look like, but is there a way for us to connect with people outdoors? Can we have these small communities and make them intentional, and really talk about what safety looks like in those ways of relating, even if those are conversations we're just having with ourselves? Like, how do we prioritize our own safety and the safety of other people? Because there's really like a need tension that comes with that. Like, we have this need for connectivity, we have this need for safety. How do we grapple with the fact that those needs might be opposing? And how do we go about making those decisions? I don't think that's easy.
No, I, personally have had, like one friend come to visit in our backyard, for example, so outside. But before, as that's coordinated, I have kind of a little spiel I send via text about my comfort level with masks or no masks, access to a restroom, right? And how that's managed so that they can, all these very explicit arrangements made in advance that we would never have given another thought to pre-pandemic, but all that takes extra effort and energy and can be a little bit uncomfortable, but helps then to kind of set a space that feels okay because no one's wondering, what the expectation is around masks, what the expectation is around whatever, that trying to be a little more explicit, I think, in advance, I think has helped manage some of that, but certainly takes more effort.
Yeah. I think there's such a greater sense of intentionality that comes with all of this. And I think in much the same way as it's more difficult to intentionally connect because we have just less natural opportunity, I think it's also requires more intentionally considering, like, what are our boundaries here? What are our expectations going to look like? And that's something I'll talk about a bit too, but like thinking about not just in the physical, literal sense, but emotionally, like what are some boundaries that need to come with this? Because I think this really puts a strain on us that's different than what we typically see in relating. And our relationship pressures that would otherwise exist are still there. It's just these now added pressures that come in.
Right. It's in combined with intentionality, it's attentionality. So what we're paying attention to now, right? When we are with people, like how much are we attending to that person and whether or not like how safe we are, as opposed to just attentionally being present with that person.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's such a huge point too. Like, there is so much demanding our attention right now. And there's so many different things that have to be considered that we've never really considered before in relating, that it can really pull us out of the present, I think, in a major way, which then deters the level of connectivity that we're getting. If we're going to go to a place where we feel unsafe or where we imagine others might be unsafe, are we able to really be present and connect with that person? Now, I think those are kind of boundaries we have to consider of like, what's my goal here in this conversation, in this interaction? And can I get that knowing that there is risk here? And that might look different for every person or every relationship, but I think that's meaningful to consider too.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I think in line with the idea of intentionality, like comes the idea of authenticity. I think that this stands out to me a lot because I think in a lot of our day-to-day interactions outside of a pandemic, we do have this tendency to kind of fall into a routine. Like, our conversations may be really brief. They may be really surface level. When someone asks us how we're doing, we're going to say, oh, doing pretty good. I'm doing fine. Like, there are these kind of like norms for relating that we have learned throughout time that I think we really implement in our day-to-day almost by habit. But I think in this specific time in the world, this gives us, I think, a lot of opportunity to evaluate, like, what are some of those patterns that maybe happen automatically, that are brief, that are surface level? And is that the best way for me to connect or relate in this moment? And it may be that we feel like for the sake of these interactions, for the sake of our own safety personally, or the sake of other people, we keep our interactions brief, we keep them surface level. But I think that there may be other times when we can say, like, what does intentionally sharing look like for me? Like, how do I be thoughtful about what I am offering of myself to another person? Or how do I be intentional about learning more about another person so that I can deepen this connection? And I think a lot of the way we learn about people comes from spending time with them. But given that there are limits on that, how do we learn? How do we gain information about the people in our world now? And how do we share of ourselves in a way that feels intentional? And I think one thing that comes up when I think about this is how much of values plays a role in relating. Like, can we use the things that we value in our relationships, about friendships, about people we love, and use that as a guide for how we're choosing to learn about people or how we're choosing to share of ourselves? I think a lot of times thinking about our closest relationships can be helpful in this. Like, with my best friend, what do I value most about that relationship? What do I value most about that person? Or with myself, like, what do I value most about who I am that I want to share with people? Like, how do I make that known in a space or in a time that's so different than what I would typically see? And how do I use communication and sharing of myself in an intentional way? Is it going to be a brief conversation, or am I going to make time for it to be deeper? Or how do I communicate what I need to see, not just in action, but verbally? Because I think now we're having to make explicit a lot of things verbally that we would typically just show in our action. And I think that's different and requires a lot more thoughtfulness too.
It makes me think about the moments where I've said, like, I'm smiling under my mask.
Yeah.
Just explicitly stating that.
Absolutely. Yeah, things that we would otherwise have these visual cues for just don't come up in the same way. I think too, even like, I think about like one way that I seek to communicate that I care about another person is through like acts of service to that person. But if I'm not in the same space as that person, how can I communicate my value for them? You know, I think that it really shifts the way we maybe showcase our love or showcase our connection for people in a way that is difficult to kind of take in or consider. Kind of along with that, I think it's meaningful to think about, like, in relating, how do we really show who we are? And I think that we're spending a lot more time with ourselves now than ever before. And I think it makes me think a lot about, like, how do I know myself in a way that lets me share of myself? And I think for a lot of students, that's not easy to identify. I guess I wonder, when you guys think about that, like, I know, Shawna, you mentioned like facial expression or like even communicating something like that. Like, are there ways that maybe you guys have thought to communicate pieces of yourself differently since all of this has happened?
In face-to-face communication or outside of that?
Whether it's in person or even outside, like using kind of the different forms of communication we've had to implement these days.
Well, you use what's available, right?
Yeah.
So if half your face is cut off, is blocked, then it's important to then use vocal inflection, right? And to either lower the voice or raise the voice to really pump up that excitement. I've even noticed that I talk louder for some reason. Like, it's like it's just a mask. It's not like, has nothing to do with hearing, but for some reason I'm talking loud, right? And so doing things like that, but squinting my eyes to show a smile, right? Like a Duchenne smile, right? Doing that kind of thing. Widening my eyes when I'm surprised, right? Because that's the only thing I have. So shifting my prosody, the rhythm and tone of my voice, you know, the speed, things like that. And then body posture, right? So using the rest of the body. I've had to use my body in ways I've actually had to become more aware of my body now and how I address folks with my body. And I think that's a positive piece. When we're talking about like students, a lot of which, the majority of which are on this campus, are between 18 and 25. So, but when you're talking about developmentally, what that means for students coming in and how they're engaging each other, we're talking about a whole, well, somewhat of a different thing, but the awareness may not necessarily be there, and it may feel really awkward to try to navigate having a lot of the affect blocked with a mask.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole way we relate is so different now. And I think even how we communicate about ourselves, what we communicate, using our bodies as a tool looks different.
Yeah, I'm thinking about another positive change, I think, is that I'm more likely now to reach out to someone if I think about them, or if I think, oh, this person would really like this podcast, where I might not really act on that in pre-pandemic life. I'm much more likely to send a text and say, hey, I was listening to this and it made me think of you, and kind of engage with someone that maybe I wouldn't have engaged with because I was going to see them at some point or have some other interaction. And so I think a little bit more electronic communication when it's occurring to me, or when I'm kind of feeling it, and then that's helping to kind of keep communication open.
Yeah, sounds like that same level of intentionality, like just thinking of, if I can't relate in an organic way that I typically would, how can I connect right now in an intentional way? And I think along with that, like thinking about intentionality, like safety has to be a lot more intentional too. I think some things to consider, especially if you're meeting new people, I know a lot of our students will use things like online apps for meeting new people and seeking to form relationships that way. And I think that comes not just with the safety of COVID, but then other safety of like, I've not met this person before. This is my first time meeting someone that I met online. How do I ensure that I'm protecting myself in that space? So things that come up for me that I think about are just knowing, we've got the option to FaceTime people or Zoom them before we meet them in person. We have the opportunity to connect wisely. So thinking about like, what's a safe space to meet when I meet with someone? Are there ways I can engage with other friends to let them know where I am or where I'll be or what to expect? Now, how do I kind of ground myself in that way, or ensure that other people know about where I am if there were to be a question of safety? And then also knowing that safety guidelines are kind of always changing within the city or within the Tulane community. How do I kind of stay updated with that so that I'm able to practice those safety guidelines whenever I do interact with people in person? Which I think is so much intentionality. It's so much to consider. And that in and of itself can be really exhausting. I think that's important to know too. Like, this is a daunting process. It's not easy to form relationships, and it's not easy to stay on top with all of the change that's happening either.
Yeah, we've been practicing this risk assessment for almost a year.
Yeah.
And thank God for technology. I mean, honestly, I couldn't imagine enduring such a pandemic without the saturation of technology that we have.
Right. Absolutely.
I think it substitutes too. It does do the safety it can, right? And it can also be used to manage some of the isolation that it's felt as well.
Yeah.
So it's just about knowing, how and when and where to use it, and knowing when it is not as safe. But for this purpose, I think that definitely using the technology to manage your own safety is powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it offers us such a great gift of connection that we otherwise wouldn't have.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think too, like, knowing as much as we are connecting through technology, whether it's for class or for, social or whatever it may be, giving ourselves grace too, to know like, it's okay to take a break. It's okay to be tired. It's okay to not want to connect right now. It's okay to not want to FaceTime someone right now. And just giving ourselves that permission too, I think, is meaningful. Because I think when we spend so much time alone, given the pandemic and everything going along with it, there can almost be this sense of pressure to spend time with people. And I think giving ourselves the grace of like, no, I can take a break right now is important too.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And I think that speaks to like boundaries in general. I think that a lot of times, like, there are not just physical boundaries that have to be considered with COVID, but emotional boundaries too. And so I wanted to talk about both of those and maybe strategies for kind of practicing those, because I think, Shawna, you said it perfectly earlier, like there's so much more to consider now in terms of safety, in terms of things like what's the bathroom, what's going on with masks. Like, we have to really make explicit things that otherwise we wouldn't even think about. So I think when thinking about physical boundaries, it can be meaningful for us to kind of consider, like, what are my preferred boundaries as it relates to safety? Like, what do I feel is meaningful for me in terms of prioritizing the safety of myself and the people that I'm around? And then also knowing that it can require us a lot to give ourselves that permission to communicate those boundaries to other people. I think there's maybe the sense of knowing that everyone kind of has a different level of comfort, a different level of what they hope for in safety. And I think it can be difficult, especially if the people around us have a different level of preferred safety than we do, to really advocate for what we want or need. Now, I think in that way, not just giving ourselves permission, but even practicing expressing boundaries to people can be really powerful, because a lot of times we haven't had to openly set those boundaries, especially as it relates to space in the same way. I think kind of breaking it down can be helpful, like kind of knowing, like, I would like, or I would feel most comfortable with this. So like, I would feel most comfortable with us all wearing our mask in this space because, and then mentioning why it's important to you, but also why it benefits the other person too. That way, I think it kind of offers this shared sense of community, you know, thinking about connectivity. Part of connecting is considering not just our needs, but the needs of the other person. So if we're able to express why it's meaningful for us, but also why it's meaningful for them, I think there's greater buy-in to the boundary from the other person, because it shows them we're considering them too. And then also practicing expressing discomfort if our boundaries aren't honored. You know, resetting a boundary in a different way, kind of speaking to more an emotional way of like, I don't feel comfortable with this action or behavior because, and what are the consequences for you and the consequences you think it has for the other person? And that doesn't necessarily mean just safety consequences. That can mean consequences for the relationship. Like, I don't feel comfortable when you don't wear a mask because I feel unsafe, but I also feel like our relationship is negatively impacted because I maybe don't feel respected in the way that I need. I think having kind of that frame can be helpful for us, not just physically, but emotionally too. I think there's a lot of rights that we have as people that are important to consider. And I love going back to our rights because I think it's something that we don't often verbalize in a meaningful way. And there are things that we have to consider for ourselves that I think we sometimes don't give ourselves permission to really sit with or know. So kind of knowing, like, we have the right to say no, and we have the right to ask for what we want. We have the right to expect honesty from other people. We have the right not to take responsibility for other people's behaviors. We have the right to feel and express our emotions. We have the right to ask for emotional support or help. We have the right to ask for personal space. We have the right to our own opinions, values, and standards. We have the right not to justify ourselves. And we can use these rights as a guide, not just when we're setting boundaries, but when we're seeking to form relationship of any kind with people, no matter the degree of closeness, if it's something brand new, if it's something we've had for years and years, these rights hold true for us. And we can use them as we're relating with people to kind of guide our action or guide the formation of the relationship in a meaningful way.
Yeah, what are these rights called? I forget the list of them. They're the personal something.
Right.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and I'd like to say that yes, all of this is true, and to be cognizant of your environment when establishing a boundary for those rights. So I wouldn't tell someone in that this is in all situations to always do that, because sometimes that doesn't bode well for folks. So,
Yeah.
but I think that, you know, in general, it is important to understand that you, as the human being, you do have a set of rights around your own body space.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a meaningful piece of this too, is there are different levels of safety we experience. There are different levels of power that exist in relationships. So the way that we hold or communicate these rights may look very different to enhance our sense of safety, to enhance our sense of self. And I think that that's really important to consider. And looking at each relationship that we're in specifically, or each social sphere, or each political, social context we're in, to kind of look at how we communicate these rights, if we choose to communicate them to anyone other than ourselves.
Yes.
Sometimes I was thinking sometimes it's more just reminding yourself, and you might not have to verbalize anything. You might just need to remind yourself of some of these rights to help manage.
Or affirm yourself through them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's so important to consider too. Like there's something about reminding ourselves of what we have the right to, of what we deserve. That's not only given ourselves a great gift, but also empowers us in an important way. I think kind of thinking about setting boundaries in general, whether it's physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, whatever it may be, I think it brings up not only a sense of discomfort, but also the importance of self-care. And I think in terms of what discomfort looks like, I think there's a lot of discomfort, at least as it relates to the pandemic, that we may need to accept, you know, knowing that a lot of our preferences for how we would communicate or how we would interact aren't as readily available. They aren't as achievable for us. And so to give ourselves the grace of knowing, in accepting that, I may be in situations or maybe relating in ways that in a different world, in a different setting or a season of life would feel awkward, may be really key right now for connecting, for giving myself the type of relationship that I want or need. And even if that's uncomfortable, seeking to find ways to connect, to foster relationship, to foster deeper connection, and to, again, know while we're lacking that sense of community in many ways that we would typically see it, we are connected in this sense of discomfort. We aren't alone in experiencing this. And it can be really important for us to know, too, that this requires a different level of taking care of ourselves, because there is so much that's different in our world right now. And so I think along with that, just knowing it can be meaningful for us, maybe more so now than ever, to check in with ourselves about what we're thinking, what we're feeling, what our body is telling us about where we're at, and seeking to care for ourselves in different ways. And whether that's through something like deep breathing or journaling or exercising, or even just using our senses to soothe ourselves. So really thinking about ways that we can take good care of ourselves and engage in activities that are enjoyable or meaningful for us, that offer a sense of rejuvenating, that really allow us to take the space that we need in a time that is unprecedented, and giving ourselves permission to take care of ourselves right now. This is not an easy space to be in. I guess it makes me think about, like, as it's related to some of the fatigue of all of this, like, have there been things that you guys have found more helpful in this season, or that maybe you've heard students find more helpful in this season than typically would be found?
I feel like for myself and for a lot of students I've talked with, it's been about taking what probably worked well before and being able to flex it a little bit. So maybe if you were a person who went to 3 45-minute yoga classes a week pre-pandemic, obviously that's got to flex a lot, right? Because there's probably not 5 classes in person, and maybe you don't have the stamina for 45 minutes. But could you do, you know, a 20-minute YouTube practice, or could you do 10 minutes of your own stretching that sort of is using something that's kind of worked, but then having a way to modify it and maybe break it down into smaller increments. I feel like I spend a lot of time helping myself and students think about how can this be maybe in smaller bite sizes to match the energy we have for it today.
Yeah. I think it's a lot about flexibility in this time. I think it requires more flexibility and more acceptance than ever before. And I think experimenting too. You know, we may not be able to utilize a lot of the things that have worked in the past in the same way. So how do we give ourselves permission to be creative or flexible in that? I think that those are the main things I really wanted to hit on today. And I thank you guys for giving me the space to talk about this. And, you know, if there are any questions that students have or come up, you know, I know Shawna's going to mention some of the resources we have and ways to connect with us, but please do reach out to us.
Definitely. Thanks for that, Taylor. I think, you know, in the same way that we have to bring so much intentionality to our day-to-day, you've, you know, very intentionally brought us this way of viewing our social interactions during this time. And we really have to take some time to be pretty explicit about how we're going to do this and continue to modify it based on what we know and understand about the pandemic. So I think this has been really, really useful and helpful for me, and I hope for all of our students.
Absolutely. And I thank you guys for the permission to be on this and talk a little bit about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think one thing we want to highlight that, you know, recognizing that everyone is managing this time differently, that if students are really struggling, the Counseling Center is an excellent resource for coming in to talk to us, and maybe come up with some more creative resources. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to show our viewers the way to access us. So just a reminder that the Uptown Counseling Center is located in the Diboll complex, right across from the Riley Center on the first floor. The clinic hours are open till 7 p.m. Monday through Thursday and open until 5 on Fridays. And the way to start the process of accessing support through the Counseling Center is to make one phone call, and we will make every effort to make sure that you get to talk with somebody that same day. So if you call 504-314-2277, you get to speak to one of the two ladies on your screen, Ms. Trelzetta Beck or Ms. Belinda Avila. They're our patient representatives, and they will work with you to schedule a time where you'll get to speak with one of our staff. You can talk a little bit about what's going on, and we can let you know about the resources, make some recommendations, and really get a plan in place for some ways that you can seek some support from the Counseling Center. Most of those appointments we're doing via Zoom right now, so you can talk with the patient representatives about how that all plays out, and then go from there. So really easy to access us. Another big piece of support, most people when they think of the Counseling Center think of individual therapy as our main mode of support, and it's the main thing that we do, but we also provide lots and lots of groups, support groups, skills-based groups, processing groups in lots of areas. And some of those groups have already started, but some are yet to get underway. So this is just a list of the offerings this semester, and if any of this looks like it's catching your eye, that first appointment, that same day consultation appointment, is an opportunity to inquire about groups and hear more about how to get involved in those. So when we talk about building relationships and having community, group therapy is a wonderful space for that to happen. And that is all I have for our resources. So many thanks to you, Taylor. Many thanks to you, Dr. Flint, as always. And I hope that our students, if they find the need for this added support, will come to visit with us, and we'll find lots of creative ways for them to build relationships.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me again.
It's great. All right, well, with that, we'll say goodbye. We'll see you all next Wednesday. Don't forget to follow TU Campus Health on our YouTube channel and Instagram for episodes of Wellbeing Wednesday every Wednesday. Thanks, y'all. Bye.